The alien woman hated being touched, until a human carefully adjusted her armor. Zyra stood still, her eyes fixed on the battlefield before her. She was a warrior of the Nock, a species known for their fierce independence and battle prowess. Yet in this moment, she felt a deep, growing discomfort. Her armor was damaged, a crack running along her left shoulder guard, which had weakened her ability to move swiftly. The sounds of the war raged around her, but she remained focused, trying to ignore the sharp pain that traveled up her arm each time she adjusted her position. Her species was proud, and the thought of needing assistance, especially from a human, left a bitter taste in her mouth. Marcus, the human assigned to assist her, approached with caution. He had heard of her reputation, how the Nock never accepted help, especially not from other races. He could sense her unease, but he also knew the mission was at risk if they didn't work together. The enemy was closing in, and if they didn't repair her armor, they would both be vulnerable. "Lieutenant Marcus," Zyra said sharply, her voice laced with irritation, "I do not need your help." Marcus took a step closer, trying to remain calm. "Zyra, you're injured. The armor needs to be fixed, or we're both in danger. I can help, just let me." "No," she interrupted, turning toward him, her gaze cold and intense. "I don't need your pity, I will fight." Her words stung, but Marcus knew better than to argue. Instead, he glanced at the damage to her armor. It was serious, and without it properly adjusted, they would be sitting ducks on the battlefield. Still, he hesitated, unsure how to proceed. He had heard the stories about the Nock and their pride. He wasn't sure how to offer his help without offending her further, but time was running out. "I'm not here to pity you," he said, trying to soften his tone. "I'm here to ensure we both survive this." Zyra's eyes narrowed. "I do not need you to survive, human." "I fought many battles alone." Marcus took a deep breath. There was no time for pride, no time for stubbornness. He needed to focus. "We don't have the luxury of fighting alone right now. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." Zyra stiffened, her body tensing. The idea of another touching her armor, adjusting it, was a violation of her personal space. Her people believed in strength, and she had always handled everything herself. But she knew Marcus was right. If she didn't allow him to help, they would both be in danger. With a frustrated sigh, Zyra reluctantly took a step back, giving Marcus the space he needed. "Fine, do it quickly." Marcus nodded, not wasting any time. He knelt down to examine the armor, his hands moving with practiced precision as he started making adjustments to the damaged area. He tried not to look at her face, but he could feel her eyes on him, the tension thick in the air. Zyra stood like a statue, unwilling to let her guard down. Every touch, every movement Marcus made seemed to be met with an inner conflict. She hated this feeling, the feeling of being vulnerable. She had always been the one to protect, not the one being protected. But in this moment, she had no choice. Her breath caught in her throat as Marcus gently pressed his hands against her armor, shifting the damaged plates into place. His touch was careful, almost respectful, as if he were handling something fragile. There was no rush in his movements, just a quiet focus as he worked. Though her instincts told her to pull away, to push him off, Zyra remained still. For some reason, she couldn't bring herself to stop him. His hands, though foreign and unwelcome, moved with such care that she felt an odd sense of relief that, for the first time in a long while, someone else was looking out for her. Still, she hated the thought of it, hated the fact that she needed him. The Nock were a proud species, and asking for help was something almost unheard of. They were trained to endure, to fight on their own. Yet here she was, standing motionless, allowing a human to adjust her armor as if it were a simple task. "Just don't expect this to happen again," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus paused for a moment but didn't look up from his work. "Understood," he said, his voice steady and neutral. He continued adjusting the armor, fine-tuning the pieces until everything was securely in place. When he was done, he stood up and took a step back. Zyra glanced down at her shoulder guard. It was no longer cracked, and the armor felt more secure, the pain from the injury slightly more manageable. "It's done," Marcus said quietly. "You should be able to move more freely now." For a moment, there was silence between them. Zyra's pride warred with her growing sense of gratitude. She didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to admit that Marcus had done something she couldn't do on her own. But the facts were undeniable. She was in better shape now, and for that, she had to give him credit. Zyra turned away, not wanting to show any weakness. "I'm fine," she said, her tone firm. "Let's finish this." Marcus nodded. "Stay close and stay sharp. We're not done yet." As they prepared to move out, Zyra couldn't shake the strange feeling lingering inside her. She didn't know what it meant, but something had changed. The warrior who once fought alone now found herself working alongside a human, someone she had once considered beneath her. But in that moment, she realized that perhaps there was strength in accepting help, in trusting someone else, even if just for a brief moment. The battlefield was silent now, the echoes of gunfire and explosions slowly fading as the dust began to settle. The two warriors, Zyra and Marcus, stood side by side, scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. The aftermath of the battle left a strange quiet in its wake, a quiet that seemed to settle heavily between them. Zyra, despite herself, couldn't ignore the way her armor now fit more comfortably, how the pain from her earlier injury was lessened. She couldn't deny that Marcus's help had made a difference, but her pride made her resent even this small debt. "You did well out there," Marcus said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of a smile in his words. He was trying in his own way to acknowledge her strength. He could sense that this wasn't easy for her. He understood pride, but he had also seen what it did to people. It made them believe they had to do everything alone. It made them feel weak when they needed others. Zyra stiffened at the words. "I did what was necessary," she replied, her tone distant and cold. She didn't want his praise. She didn't want anything from him. Marcus didn't press her. He simply nodded, adjusting his weapon and glancing at their surroundings once more. It was clear the enemy was retreating, but that didn't mean the danger had passed. Not yet. As they moved through the abandoned ruins of the battlefield, Zyra found herself constantly aware of Marcus's presence beside her. His footsteps were steady. The way he moved with confidence despite the chaos that had just unfolded was something she couldn't help but notice. And then there was his calm demeanor, how he kept his head even when things were at their worst. She wanted to push those thoughts away. She didn't need him to be calm. She didn't need anyone, especially not a human, to show her how to stay composed in battle. She was Nock. She had fought through worse, endured more pain than he could ever imagine. She didn't need him. She kept telling herself that, but there was a part of her that wasn't so sure anymore. They reached a small clearing, the distant hum of their damaged ships filling the air as they prepared to regroup with the rest of the squad. Zyra could see the other soldiers, some of them human, some of them Nock, gathered around a makeshift camp. She was eager to get back to her people, to her own kind, to the warriors who didn't need help. But as she started to move toward the camp, she felt a tug at her side. Marcus had stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Zyra," he said softly, "you should rest." "You're not fully healed." Zyra froze. For a moment, she didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to anyone caring for her well-being in such a way. She had always been the one to care for others, to look after the wounded, never the other way around. The human's touch, brief as it was, felt like a shock to her system. She wanted to push him away, to snap at him, but something in his eyes stopped her. "I don't need rest," she said, her voice tight, though she could feel the exhaustion creeping up on her. "I'll fight until the end." Marcus didn't pull away, but his eyes softened. "I know you will, but even the strongest warriors need time to recover." For the first time since they had started this mission, Zyra felt a strange, unfamiliar feeling, a mixture of frustration and confusion. She wasn't used to being cared for, and she didn't know how to deal with it. She had always been the one to protect, not the one to be protected. The thought of weakness, of showing vulnerability, filled her with a deep, gnawing fear. "Please," Marcus said, his voice firm but kind, "just sit down for a moment. You've earned it." Zyra looked away from him, not wanting to acknowledge how his words had affected her. She didn't want to sit. She didn't want to rest. But as she glanced around, she saw the other soldiers resting, leaning against the wreckage of their ships, taking brief moments of solace before they had to move again. It was clear they had all been through a lot, but somehow the thought of stopping felt like surrender. She had never been good at surrendering. Still, she allowed herself to sit down, reluctantly leaning against the hull of a nearby ship. She kept her eyes forward, away from Marcus, but the quiet lingered between them. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the way he was observing her, like he understood something she didn't want to admit. Marcus sat beside her, but he didn't push her to talk or share anything. He simply sat in silence, keeping watch. Zyra couldn't help but wonder why he wasn't angry at her for pushing him away, for resisting his help at every turn. She had given him nothing but coldness and disdain, and yet here he was, sitting next to her, not saying a word. The minutes passed slowly, and Zyra tried her best to ignore the strange comfort she felt in his presence. She couldn't quite understand it, couldn't bring herself to admit that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. That maybe there was something to be said for trust. "You're not like the others," Zyra said abruptly, breaking the silence. Her voice was softer now, almost like a confession. "Most humans, they're loud, they think they know everything, they want to be in charge." Marcus glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not like most humans," he replied quietly. "I've had to earn my place just like you've had to earn yours. We all have our struggles, our battles." Zyra looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She could see the scars on his face, the weariness in his eyes. She could see the way he carried himself, like a man who had been through war, who had learned the hard way that survival meant working together, no matter how hard it was. She had never expected to find any sort of kinship with a human. But now, as they sat there in the quiet of the battlefield, something had shifted. She could still feel the pride in her chest, the desire to prove that she didn't need anyone. But for the first time in a long time, she realized that perhaps needing someone didn't make her weak, it made her human. "I'm not used to this," Zyra admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know how to accept help." Marcus didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded as if he understood. He knew she wasn't used to asking for help, but what mattered was that she was trying. That was all anyone could ask for. "We don't always have to do it alone," Marcus said finally. "That's what makes us stronger." Zyra looked at him, her pride still strong but starting to bend just a little. She wasn't ready to fully admit that Marcus had helped her more than she could have imagined. But in that moment, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. Not from the battle, not from victory, but from the quiet understanding between the two of them. As the camp settled into an uneasy peace, Zyra allowed herself to rest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she didn't feel like she had to face it alone. The sun had begun to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The once bustling battlefield was now quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional distant rumble of engines. The camp was calm, but the tension remained. Zyra couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than the skirmish they had just fought. Her instincts told her to stay alert, to keep her guard up, but part of her that she didn't want to admit, was beginning to trust Marcus. It wasn't easy. She had been trained to rely only on herself, to never show weakness, to never need anyone. But Marcus, for some reason, was different. He was calm, steady, and he didn't push her when she didn't want to talk. He respected her space, but at the same time he was always there when she needed him. Zyra stood by the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames as they danced in the evening air. The warmth of the fire was a small comfort, but her thoughts were far from the moment. Her mind was on the mission, on the next battle, on what would happen when they reached the enemy's stronghold. She had no illusions about what awaited them. This was not going to be an easy fight. They were outnumbered, and the enemy was ruthless. "Zyra," Marcus's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to find him approaching, his face serious but kind. "You've been quiet. Are you okay?" She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine, just thinking about the battle ahead." Marcus stood next to her, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I get it, but remember, we don't have to face this alone. We've got a team and we've got each other." Zyra stiffened at the words. She wasn't used to relying on others. She had always been taught to fight for herself, to never show any vulnerability. But there was something in Marcus's tone, something in the way he said those words that made her hesitate. "I don't need anyone to fight for me," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I can handle this myself." Marcus didn't argue. He simply nodded as if he understood. He knew better than to push her further. Instead, he glanced down at her armor, noticing the way she still adjusted it every so often, as if checking that everything was secure. The truth was, she was still in pain. Her injury had healed somewhat, but the effects lingered. "You sure about that?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Because I saw how you were earlier. You're not invincible, Zyra." Zyra's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. She couldn't deny that he was right. She had needed help, and he had given it without question. It made her uncomfortable, but she had no choice but to accept it. And now, as they stood together by the fire, she found herself considering something she had never thought about before. Maybe it wasn't a weakness to need help. Maybe it was just part of being human, of being alive. "I'll be ready for the fight," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "Don't worry about me." "I'm not worried about you," Marcus said, his gaze still on her. "I'm worried about the both of us. We're stronger together." Zyra didn't respond right away. She just stood there watching the fire flicker in the growing darkness. She wasn't sure what to make of his words. She didn't know how to feel about this strange partnership they had developed. But she did know one thing: it was different, and that difference made her uneasy. The night stretched on, and eventually they were called to attention. The enemy was on the move, and their scouts had reported that the stronghold was within reach. The time to prepare was over. It was time to act. Zyra stood tall, her armor gleaming in the firelight. Her pulse quickened as the reality of what lay ahead settled in. She had fought many battles in her life, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher. The enemy was more dangerous, and yet, for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. Marcus was beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a strange comfort knowing that he was there, that they would face this together. "We move at dawn," Zyra said, her voice low but filled with resolve. "Get some rest." "We'll need our strength," Marcus nodded, but before he turned to leave, he paused. "Zyra, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Zyra didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. She didn't want to acknowledge the softness in his voice, the sincerity behind his words. But deep down, she knew that something had shifted between them. There was trust now, something she hadn't been willing to admit before. As Marcus walked away to prepare for the battle, Zyra stayed by the fire a little longer. She stared into the flames, her mind racing with thoughts of the battle, of survival, and of what came next. The idea of relying on anyone still felt strange to her, but she couldn't deny the truth. She was starting to trust him, and that terrified her. The hours passed slowly, and the camp fell into a tense silence. Zyra tried to sleep, but her thoughts kept her awake. She thought about the mission, about the future, about the people who depended on her. But most of all, she thought about Marcus. She had always believed that strength came from within, that a warrior had to stand alone. But now, for the first time, she wondered if maybe strength came from something else, something deeper. Maybe it came from the bonds we form, from the people we allow ourselves to trust. At dawn, the call to action was sounded, and the camp came alive with motion. Zyra rose to her feet, adjusting her armor, her mind clear. She was ready. She had to be. The battle was coming, and there was no turning back. As they prepared to move out, Marcus appeared beside her, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. There was something unspoken between them, something that neither of them could fully express. But Zyra knew in that moment that they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came their way. And maybe, just maybe, they would survive this battle, and the next, because they were no longer alone. The camp was still and quiet before dawn, the air heavy with the weight of the coming battle. Zyra stood near the edge of the clearing, her hands resting on the hilt of her weapon, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. She could feel the tension in the air, like the stillness before a storm. Every muscle in her body was alert, every sense heightened. The war was far from over, and this next fight would be just as hard, if not harder, than the last. Behind her, she could hear the soft sounds of the other soldiers preparing, the murmur of voices low and steady. Marcus was among them, his presence reassuring yet distant, as if he too felt the weight of the moment. They hadn't spoken much since the night before, but she knew that they were both thinking about the same thing: their next move, the risks they would face, and what would happen after the battle was over. Zyra shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to steady her nerves. She wasn't used to this feeling, this strange combination of fear and anticipation. She had fought many battles in her life, but this one felt different. The enemy they were up against was unlike any she had faced before. They were fierce, merciless, and they didn't play by the rules. She had no doubt that this fight would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, the command was given. The soldiers, both human and alien, began to move out in formation, their weapons ready and their eyes focused. Zyra followed closely behind the others, her steps purposeful but calculated. Her mind was sharp, her focus unwavering. This was what she had trained for, what she had been born for. But even with all her strength, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. Marcus walked beside her, his face set in a determined expression. There was no small talk between them as they moved through the dense forest. The quiet was a comfort, a chance to gather their thoughts before the chaos began. Zyra couldn't help but notice how steady his movements were, how he always seemed to know exactly where to step, how to position himself. She had seen the same kind of focus in herself before battles, but now, as she walked beside him, she realized that it wasn't just the battle she was focused on. It was him. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shout from the front of the group. A scout had spotted movement up ahead. The enemy was close. Zyra's hand tightened on her weapon and her heart began to race. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The command came to spread out and take cover. Zyra moved quickly, finding a spot behind a large boulder, her back pressed against the cold stone. She could hear the others positioning themselves around her, the crackling of branches underfoot as they readied for the assault. She stole a glance at Marcus, who was crouched behind a tree nearby. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and for the first time since the mission began, Zyra felt a sense of connection that went beyond the battlefield. They were a team now, no longer strangers thrown together by chance. They had fought side by side, and in that fight something had shifted between them. A bond had formed, built on respect and trust. It was fragile, but it was there. And it made her feel something she couldn't quite name, something warm and unfamiliar. But there was no time for emotions now. The enemy was closing in. Zyra's pulse quickened, and her focus sharpened as the first shots rang out in the distance. The battle had begun. The enemy emerged from the trees, their weapons raised and ready. Zyra didn't hesitate. She sprang into action, her body moving with practiced precision as she took down the first enemy soldier with a swift blow. Her mind was a blur of motion and strategy, each move calculated, each decision made in an instant. She had fought countless battles before, but this one felt different. Every step, every swing of her weapon was fueled by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. She had Marcus at her side. There was no time to check on him, no time to think about anything other than the fight. The world around her became a blur of action, the sound of weapons firing, the clash of metal on metal, the cries of pain and defiance. Zyra was in her element now, her instincts guiding her every move. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, pushing her forward, making her stronger with each passing second. But even in the midst of the chaos, she could sense Marcus nearby, moving with the same steady precision as before. She could hear his voice shouting orders, directing the others with confidence. It was strange how much she had come to rely on him in such a short time. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to stand alone. But now, in this battle, she realized that she wasn't standing alone at all. The enemy was relentless, but so were they. Zyra fought with everything she had, each strike, each maneuver, bringing them closer to victory. But it wasn't easy. The enemy was strong, and their numbers seemed endless. Every time Zyra thought they had gained ground, more soldiers would emerge from the shadows, ready to fight to the death. It was exhausting. Every muscle in her body ached, every breath came in ragged gasps. But she pushed forward, knowing that they couldn't afford to stop. Not now, not when they were so close. Hours passed in a blur of violence and chaos. The sun was high in the sky when Zyra finally saw the moment she had been waiting for. The enemy's line was breaking. Their forces were scattered, disorganized. The victory was within reach. But just as she prepared to push forward, a sudden explosion rocked the ground beneath her feet. The shockwave sent her flying, her body crashing to the ground with a violent thud. For a moment, everything was disoriented, her vision spinning. She could hear shouting, gunfire, the sounds of battle raging on, but everything felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Then through the haze, she saw him, Marcus. He was running toward her, his face filled with concern, his hand reaching out to help her up. "Zyra," he called, his voice filled with urgency. She shook her head, trying to clear the dizziness. "I'm fine," she muttered, though she could feel the blood dripping from a cut on her forehead. Her vision was blurry and her head throbbed, but she forced herself to her feet, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. Marcus didn't say anything. He just pulled her up, his grip firm but gentle. For a moment their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, Zyra felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She wasn't sure what it was, but she realized that she needed him. She needed this team, and for the first time she didn't mind the thought. "We've got this," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We finished this together." And together they did. The battle raged on for hours more, but with their combined strength they pushed through. Slowly, the enemy forces began to retreat, their resistance weakening. Zyra fought until her limbs were sore, until her body felt like it could no longer move. But through it all, Marcus was there, by her side, fighting with the same determination. By the time the sun set, the battlefield was silent once more. The enemy had been defeated, their stronghold taken. Zyra stood among the wreckage, her body exhausted but her spirit unbroken. She had fought for victory and she had achieved it. But more than that, she realized something important in the quiet of the aftermath. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something more, something bigger than herself. And that, for the first time, made her feel truly alive. The battle had ended, but the silence that followed was anything but peaceful. Zyra stood among the wreckage, the faint smell of smoke still in the air, mingling with the scent of the earth. The sun had set hours ago, and the sky was now a deep shade of blue, with scattered stars beginning to peek through the darkness. The battlefield, once alive with chaos and violence, was now eerily still. The ground was littered with debris, weapons, and fallen soldiers. The enemy was defeated, but at a cost. Zyra wiped the sweat from her brow, her body aching from the fight. She wasn't used to feeling like this, exhausted, vulnerable, and strangely grateful. The weight of the victory still hung in the air, but there was no time for celebration. The war was far from over, and they would need to keep moving forward. She looked over at Marcus, who was standing nearby, talking to some of the other soldiers. He looked just as tired as she felt, but there was something else in his expression, something she hadn't seen before. It was a quiet pride, the kind that came from knowing they had done something important. They had won not just the battle, but also the trust they had built together. For a moment, Zyra considered walking over to him. She had always been the one to carry the weight of her emotions alone, to keep her thoughts to herself. But now, she felt an urge to acknowledge something that had been growing between them. They had fought side by side, and for the first time she realized that she hadn't felt alone in that fight. She had felt his presence beside her, steady and unwavering, and it had made all the difference. Marcus noticed her standing there, his eyes meeting hers across the clearing. He smiled faintly and began to walk toward her. Zyra didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to expressing gratitude, especially not to someone like him. But as he came closer, she found the words. "You did well," she said quietly, her voice rough from the strain of the battle. I didn't expect you to fight like that." Marcus stopped in front of her, his expression softening. "I'm not just a soldier, Zyra. I fight for something more than just orders. I fight for the people I trust, the ones who stand beside me." Zyra looked away, unsure of what to make of his words. She had always fought alone, but now, with him standing there, she realized how much it meant to have someone by her side. It wasn't just the battle that had changed her, it was him. I didn't think I could trust anyone like you," Zyra admitted, her voice quieter now. "But after all this, I'm not sure I can keep doing this alone." Marcus nodded slowly, as if he understood. "You don't have to," he said, his voice low but sincere. "We're in this together now, Zyra. I don't know what comes next, but I know we can face it as a team." Zyra swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She wasn't used to this kind of connection, this kind of partnership. But there was something in Marcus's voice, in the way he looked at her, that made her believe him. "I'm not used to depending on anyone," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "I've always been the one others depended on. I never let anyone get too close." Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against her shoulder, gentle but firm. "You don't have to carry everything alone. You don't have to protect everyone by yourself. That's what we're here for, each other." The touch, simple as it was, sent a ripple of warmth through Zyra. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the battle they had just fought together, or maybe it was the way Marcus made her feel like she wasn't just a weapon or a soldier, but a person who could still rely on others. "I don't know how to do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to try." Marcus smiled, a small, reassuring smile that softened the edges of the tension between them. "We'll figure it out, together." Zyra nodded, though she didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future would hold or where this path would take them. But for the first time, she felt like she could walk it with someone else by her side. The sound of footsteps approaching broke the moment, and Zyra turned to see the rest of the soldiers gathering around, ready to move out. The mission wasn't over, there was still more to be done. But now, as she looked at the people around her, Marcus included, she didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her alone. She had a team. She had Marcus. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The group set out from the battlefield, moving through the woods toward their next destination. The journey was long, and the air was thick with uncertainty. But as Zyra walked beside Marcus, she felt a quiet sense of peace she hadn't known before. They were facing the unknown together, and that gave her more strength than any armor ever could. The path ahead was still dangerous, still filled with obstacles they couldn't predict. But now, Zyra knew one thing for certain: she wasn't fighting alone anymore. And that made all the difference. As the night sky deepened above them, the stars shining brightly overhead, Zyra allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in a long time: hope. It wasn't a promise of easy victories or a guarantee that everything would be okay. But it was the knowledge that, whatever came next, she would face it with the strength of her newfound allies at her side.